Okay, today we're going to talk about three different items that are made from rice, and the shilas about them, the Bishul questions about them, all revolve around a similar point, so they have something in common. And excuse me, the working assumption for this whole discussion is going to be that if I make a pot of rice, it needs Bishul Yisroel because it's not edible raw, and rice is Earl Shach Malachim, and therefore we're going to assume that rice as is, just cooked rice as is, needs Bishul Yisroel. The question is whether the foods we're going to be talking about should have that same status as well. Okay, and the first one is rice pudding. Rice pudding is made by cooking rice, but you don't just cook it like a regular, like you do in your house. You just cook and cook and cook, keep on going until the individual, grains, I don't know what you call them, start to dissolve into the point that it eventually solidifies into like a pudding, what we call like a rice pudding, like a cocoa. Now, regular, as I mentioned a second ago, regular rice is Earl Shach Malachim. Rice pudding is not Earl Shach Malachim. So the question is like this: as when you make rice pudding, partway through the cooking, it's regular rice. You put in the raw rice, you cook it and you cook it and you keep on going until eventually it turns into rice pudding. But at some point in the middle of that, it was regular rice. It only became rice pudding because you just overdo it. You just keep on going and going and going until it becomes this mush. So should we say the finished product is not Earl Shach Malachim, so we don't need Bishul Yisroel because it's not what we made is not Earl Shach Malachim? Or should we say no? Halfway through it was Earl Shach Malachim, so it became Asur at that point. At that point, it was something that needed Bishul Yisroel, and a guy didn't have anything to do with it. It should be Asur, and therefore it should stay as Bishul Akum. So Rav Shachta thought that as long as we do this all in one long process, you don't need Bishul Yisroel. And he said it really based on what the Ramah says. The Ramah says that this is din, that if a guy cooks a food till it's kamaycha ben jusai, that food becomes Asur. That's Bishul Akum. But if a yid is part of the rest of the cooking to make it from kamaycha ben jusai to be fully cooked, then that food becomes mutter. In the words of the Rajba, it's Isra Chayzel Hasheri. So this is something really unusual about Bishul Akum, that a food could be Asur at one point when the guy cooked it, and then it become mutter later on. That's a very unusual possibility. Again, in Machaber doesn't even hold of it. So the Ramah holds we can't do that. So Shechta said we could say a similar thing, not exactly the same thing, but something similar over here also, which is we could look at the I got a word wrong over here. We could look at the partially cooked rice and say, well, halfway through the cooking of this pudding, it was Bishul Akum. But instead, we don't look at it that. We look at it as the whole process, the whole thing all together. And since in the end, it's not Bishul Akum, therefore it's okay. Now that I said it a certain way, Rav Shachta said actually himself a little bit differently. He said that the Ramah that says that it could be Isra Chayzer Sheroi is really based on the logic that the Avnei Nezer says. Avnei Nezer says like this. He says Bishul Akum is not regular machalas asuras. Regular machalas asuras means is this food is something that Hashem doesn't want us to have about it, or the Chacham don't want us to have about it, and therefore the food is asur. So in that case, if it would be machalas asuras, it would mean this: Chacham want us to stay away from intermarriage, and they therefore decreed that food cooked by a guy is isur. That would be a way to call it machalas asuras based on a logic, but the end of the day would be machalas asuras. And Avnei says no, it's not pshat. It's not machalas asuras. It's an isser for us. The Chacham said, don't eat that food. Don't you yid, don't eat that food because it could lead to intermarriage. And they call that isser on the person. We call that Bishul Akum. So it's not isser on the food, it's an isser on the person. And therefore, it's possible the isser could be undone. If it was an isser on the food, you can't say a food that's usher today could become much later on. Asur is asur. If it's asur, it's gone. It's hopeless. You can't do anything about it. But the reason why it works is because it's Isra on me. Well, the Isra on me. Well, if today there's a concern of Bishul Akum. If in an hour from now there's no concern of Bishul Akum, then there's no Isra for me to eat it, and then Chacham could allow the food. And the same thing over here also is that the food, when it's at the part of the process, it would have been a concern of Bishul Akum if I would. It would be a concern that it could lead to intermarriage if I would eat it then. But since by the end of the process it's beyond that, and it's something that doesn't need is also concerned, then the Isser can go off. Rosh Hashanah thought that it was mutter. Now, I know we're talking about rice, but I'm going to mention another example of this point Rosh Hashanah just made, which is not a rice example. It came up recently. A company wanted to freeze dry salmon to make pet food out of it. So what they were doing was they took raw salmon. It's a little unusual situation. They took raw salmon, put it into the machine, and first it baked the salmon, and then it freeze dried it. So baked salmon is oila shochem lachem. Freeze-dried salmon is not. So since the entire production went from being raw to being freeze-dried in one long process, even though in the middle there was a time when it was just good, nice, plain piece of baked salmon that theoretically needed Bishul Yisroel, the overall process does not need Bishul Yisroel. Okay, so now that was our first case of rice, was rice pudding. Next is, let's talk about crisp rice. The brand name, of course, of that is Rice Krispies, but for the world, it's called crisp rice. The finished product, the cereal that you make at the end of the process that you finish with, the Rice Krispies that you have, are not ola shochem lachem. But the question is that in the middle, there's a part of the process where it seems like it should be an issue, and that is the way you make crisp rice is first you have to. Not everyone does like this, but the common thing to do is you cook the rice first with steam and water, and then you put it into an oven to sort of get it to pop, to turn it into what we all know as Rice Krispies. There's another way of doing it also. You add moisture in a pressurized container, and then you release the pressure, and that causes it to pop. But the assumption, the cook first, you have to cook the rice. Well, so the question here is like this: now, someone who at a company said to us that after that cooking, it's just, it's basically rice. He said, it's maybe a little tougher than regular rice that didn't absorb so much moisture, but basically it's rice, and therefore for pause, our question leads us to our question, our same question as we had beforehand. We have rice that's cooked, and then later on at that point it would be ola shochem lachem. Later it goes on and keeps on. You do another thing. You do more to it and make it to be not ola shochem lachem. I mean, you turn it into Rice Krispies, into crisp rice. And the question is, should that need Bishul Yisroel? Now, before we go on, I just want to mention something. Just what they said is it hasn't absorbed so much moisture. Just throw in a piece of information here that as rice cooks, it absorbs water. It starts at about, what I'm told, at about 12% moisture, and it gets to about 60% moisture, give or take, to be fully cooked. So what's going on in this case is the moisture here is about 30% moisture, and the amount of moisture that is absorbed into the rice is a sort of a way to measure how well the rice is cooked. So 30% moisture tells us that it's a partially cooked rice. If we get all the way to 60-ish%, maybe 58%, or a little more than 60%, that would be fully cooked. This is mostly cooked. Okay, so question is, what's the din about this rice? Does this need to be Bishul Yisroel? So Rebelski said like this. He said it depends how you make this. If these two stages, cooking and popping, are done in one long process, if it's done in one long process, like was done by the rice pudding, then it'll be fine, because we'd say it goes from being raw to being not oila shochem lachem all in one step, and therefore it will be fine. But if it takes two steps, meaning first there's a step, the cooking step, and then you stop, and then you move it to another machine, or you do something else to make it become popped, then you need Bishul Yisroel. In other words, which is to say is, which is typically what goes on. So if it has one step of cooking it to make it into a cooked rice, now it's Bishul Akum. Then the fact that you afterwards went ahead and you did something else to make it not ola shochem lachem would not have been, Rebelski said, would not be enough to make it okay. Now, you could imagine someone taking what Rav Shechter said, the way he said originally, and going to an extreme and saying even if it would be in two steps. Rav Shechter was making it like as if this is Isra Chayzer Hechsheroi. You can make it not later on. I don't think that's how most would assume. I'm not even sure if Shechter himself thought like that. You could go if it was in two separate stages. So this is, at this point, we were holding is that if it turns out that it's done in two steps, then the Rice Krispies should need Bishul Yisroel. But after that, I went to factories, and I mentioned a second ago that someone at a manufacturer said basically it tastes like good old rice. Yeah, basically it's rice after the first step of it. But that's not at all what I saw. Okay, after seeing the rice, the first coming out of the first part of the process, it was so awful looking and so undesirable. I mean, mushy and not mushy. It was like clumpy. I'm not describing this well. You just looked at the thing and you said, there's no way that food could be oil shochem lachem. It wasn't clear to me whether it's because they're using a specific type of rice that's really good for making Rice Krispies, or they use other ingredients into the cooking of the rice that would eventually be helpful for when they had to pop it. I'm not sure what it was, but it was clear that rice coming out of that had been cooked was not going to be oil shochem lachem. So in which case, there was never a stage when it was oil shochem lachem, not from the cooking and not from the popping. Neither of them was oil shochem lachem, and then it would be mutter. So if that's accurate of what really goes on every place, then there's no question. There isn't any stage when it's oil shochem lachem that's edible and oil shochem lachem, so it wouldn't be a problem. It wouldn't need Bishul Yisroel. If there would be a situation where the first it was cooking, and it became oil shochem lachem, and it became regular normal rice that's oil shochem lachem, and then afterwards you popped it, then Rabowski had said was no, since if it's in two separate stages, then it needs Bishul Yisroel, and we can't say. And because in the middle it became awesome. Okay, that was our second case. Now, a third case of rice is sake, which is an alcoholic beverage made from rice. Whatever I'm going to tell you about that is really based on a lot of work that Rabbi Akiva Nihas did on this subject, trying to understand whether sake needs Bishul Yisroel or not. So the usual rule is that alcoholic beverages made from grain, like beer, think about beer that's made from barley, doesn't need Bishul Yisroel, and the reason is because we treat it like it's flavored water. What I mean to say is that of the two ingredients, there's water, so to speak, there's water, and there's the barley and other things that are added to make beer or other alcoholic beverages. That the ikar is the water, the other things are tuffle. What do you mean they're tuffle? I mean, of course, everybody's drinking this because they don't drink water. The point is, but it's just considered like a flavoring. Comes from a taisis, brought in a taz. The water is just, the other things are just a flavoring to the water to make the water taste better. So, therefore, water doesn't need Bishul Yisroel. Water is edible raw, so it doesn't need Bishul Yisroel. So, therefore, the whole overall beer or alcoholic beverage does not need Bishul Yisroel because it's treated overall as something that's edible raw, because the barley parts of it are just tuffle, secondary. They don't make a difference. Price says it also, and that's why we make a shakal on it, because the water is considered ikar, not the barley and other ingredients. Now, all that is fine for most alcoholic beverages. Doesn't really work for sake, because sake is made. If you don't make, you cook the rice first and then you mix it with everything else and turn it, and then you add it to the water and start making it into the alcoholic beverage. So if the rice is made by itself first, then we don't have this logic from Tosfos to say why it should not need Bishul Yisroel, and since it happens in two steps, then we don't have the kula we've been talking about until now, which is, well, it's one long step to go from raw to not oil shochem lachem, and we don't care what happens in the middle. No, here it's in two separate steps. First you cook it. After you finish cooking it, then you go ahead and you ferment it and turn it into sake. So what would be our reason? Is there a reason to be mutter? Okay, now, when we talked about the crisp rice, the end of our discussion there was that it turned out that the way they made the rice made it not oil shochem lachem, even as the rice stage. So we avoided the need for Bishul Yisroel over there, because we said even though it's two steps, but the end of the first stage, it's not oil shochem lachem just because of the way they produce it. So the question was, is that true for the sake rice also? So to understand why, at least why we thought it should be, that there was a reason that would be a reason to be makel, is because of the way you make sake, and that is, rice has in it some fat and some protein and a lot of starch, and it's the starchy part of the grain that's going to eventually turn into the sake. It's going to ferment and become the sake. So people who are making sake, what they do is they have rice that they mill to remove the fat and protein layers, because those are a waste. They don't get anything from them. And then they just have the center part of the starch, the central part of the starch of the rice, which is the starchy part. So when you cook this rice, when the sake company cooks the rice, as they're getting ready to make the sake, it comes out dry and chewy. And when you look at it and you taste it, you say, "Nah, this stuff is not oil shochem lachem." So maybe there's no need for Bishul Yisroel, because the kind of rice that they're using, and as they've done things to it or they grew it a certain way, that the rice that they're using is not rice that's oil shochem lachem. The way it's made, either because it grows a certain kind of rice, or because they remove all these other layers before they cook it, or the two of them together, whatever it is, the rice at that point seemed like it was dry and chewy. It didn't seem at all like rice that should be oil shochem lachem. So that would be reason to be makel. So that seemed like good news. However, and then that was the thinking at one point. But Rabbi Kuber said he questioned. He said, I'm not sure that you're making sense over here. He says I suspect that really the rice is not much different than any other rice at that point, as far as taste wise, etc. And the reason why you think it has this chewy taste to it is just because it's not fully cooked. Now, not being fully cooked, it could still be bishul akum, because even if it's made passably edible, that's already could be bishul akum. He says, but if you just let them finish the cooking, you would find out that I think it might taste like just like perfectly fine rice. Now, what that means is to say, is just as an aside here, is that there's a general question. Whenever we have food that's kamaycha ben jasoi, that's enough. If a guy cooked the kamaycha ben jasoi, the food is asur, it's bishul akum. And there's an obvious question that, what do you mean kamaycha ben jasoi? It's anything that's kamaycha ben jasoi is just barely edible. Of course, it's not oil shochem lachem in that form. So why is it bishul akum? It's not oil shochem lachem. And the answer is because it's come to Dr. Tshuva brings from a Sefer called Chesed Avram. He brings that to say that when something needs just tikkun k'tzas, then that's what the guy did is considered to have made it oil shochem lachem, even though it needs a little bit of extra help in order to make it become oil shochem lachem. And so the cooking that we take it from being kamaycha ben jasoi to finish the cooking is enough. It is qualifies as tikkun k'tzas, and needs just a little bit of help, and then needs just a little bit of help, basically. But the guy did made it cooked at oil shochem lachem, and the fact that it needs some more stuff done to it doesn't make a difference. So, in the same thing over here also, if it's true that the guy cooking it made it edible, made it passably edible, which it was passably edible, even though it's not yet oil shochem lachem because it needs to be fully cooked, then he argued and he says, well, I think that if you make it, that's considered, if you fully cooked it, you would see that it really is oil shochem lachem and it tastes fine. Okay, so Rabbi has tried that. He took some of the rice from the factory that had been cooked like they had done, and again, he made this not really tasty stuff at the way it was, and finished off the cooking for it, and then he tasted it, and Rabbi Reese tasted it, and they said, yeah, taka, it's true. Rabbi Kuber was correct that the food is oil shochem lachem. It tastes perfectly fine, and this that it tasted odd beforehand is only because it was not fully cooked. But had it been fully cooked, when it reaches the stage of being fully cooked, it tastes just as good as any other rice. So at this point where we're standing now, we have a problem. Well, we have a problem. We have a need for Bishul Yisroel because it's a 2-stage process. So the fact, and at the end of the first stage, at the end of the cooking stage, it's oil shochem lachem, in which case the fact that it later turns into something that's just tafel is not going to make a difference to us. We should have a problem. But that was only so far. The final conclusion was that you can assume that the sake does not need Bishul Yisroel. And the first is because, and there were 2 reasons why. The first reason is Kamat always the sake companies cook their rice in live steam, and many hashkachas, us included, assume that when you cook something in live steam, just pumping, blowing steam at it, that's similar enough to smoking that doesn't need Bishul Yisroel. We spoke about this when we learned Bishul akum. So for us, that was enough reason to be makel. Say it's cooked with live steam. Cooking with steam is not something that requires Bishul Yisroel. But the second reason is that when we learned Bishul akum, we spoke about this also, that Rav Moshe told Rav Natan Greenblatt that Bishul akum doesn't apply when food is cooked in a factory using equipment that's radically different from what you have at home. So, first of all, it only applies in a factory. It doesn't apply like in a house cooking. And that had to do with the logic for it. It applies only like in a factory type setting. And second is it only applies, this kula is only when it uses something that's very different. Not just a bigger pot, but something that's just radically different from what people have in their homes. So most companies who make sake, especially the ones who are exporting to the United States, are going to using specialized equipment. I'll explain what those are in a second. And therefore, for those who are samich on this tshuva from this psak from Moshe, or who are samich on a bitzir of other things, like bitzir of steam, would be makel about that over here, or could be makel about that here also. So there were 3 Rabbi Nihas found that there were 3 ways that people cook the rice. First way is that the traditional way of cooking it is they take this big, huge wooden barrels. I'll call them something like a barrel, sort of a pot. They call it a kashiki. I think that's how you pronounce it. And it has holes in the bottom of it. You blow steam from the bottom, and it cooks the rice. Okay. Now, a big wooden pot, a big wooden kettle with holes in the bottom of it is nothing like people cook at home. So that would be good enough for a Moshe. Qualify for a Moshe. The second way of cooking it is doing the same thing, but instead of wood, they make it out of metal. That's already very much like a pot. Basically, that's like a steamer that we have in our home, that people have in their homes. And that Rosh Hashanah thought that does would not qualify for what Moshe said. The last is that in large companies, both of these two that I mentioned until now are batch processes. I put the rice into this vat or container, or whatever you want to call it, and I cook the rice. And then empty it out and go on with the next batch. But large manufacturing companies want to use things in the continuous process. So the rice goes onto a belt that goes, pulls the rice along, and by the time it gets to the other end of the belt, it's been steamed enough that it's cooked. So it's a continuous process. You keep dumping on rice on the one side, and it comes over on the other side fully cooked. And that's, of course, nothing like you have in your house. It's even less than the wooden pot, with holes in the bottom of it. And nothing like what people have in their homes. So for those who accept what Moshe says, or are Saimach on it, B'tzir of other things, could be make on that. When he asked Rosh Hashanah about it, Rosh Hashanah said that you could be assumed that the sake a person's getting, especially in the United States, you're getting stuff that's exported. So who's exporting? Some larger companies. You can assume you're getting from one of the companies that use this unusual equipment, and for those could be Samachar Moshe. Again, and I mentioned earlier, we hold everybody cooks it with steam, and we make on that alone. And Rosh Hashanah is just talking about for those who are not, could assume that it's going to be made in the specialized equipment and be samech on that b'tzir of the steam.